certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
A key scientist today defended PathWest practices, disputing the defence team's contamination theory. It's day 55 of Claremont in Conversation. Thanks for joining us. You're with Natalie, Tim and Alison. And we've heard so much about contamination, but today in court, you heard about numbers that really told a different story.
Yeah, well, this was the day that PathWest fought back, I suppose, Nat. I mean, we did go quite hard on them last week, end of last week, and from what we've heard, that was fair comment. I certainly thought so anyway, in terms of all the contamination events that had occurred over the journey. We had at least 7 in-house, and then the previous sort of blank samples that we'd heard had also been found to be contaminated. But today, Mr. Egan, Scott Egan, was asked to defend himself and the lab, basically, in terms of statistics, in terms of what he termed as quality issues, and he'd been asked to top them up over the 25 years that they've been doing work on this case, which included the Clarke case in '95. And he came up with a number, and then he came up with a percentage, which he said showed that they were well within decent levels of quality control. And in the one case study that he used to compare it to, they were actually twice as good as a study that had been done in Holland. So yeah, it really was the day that Mr. Egan was asked to defend himself and the lab, and he did that quite strongly.
And up until then, though, we were hearing about a lot of other muddles that came through today and prompting a lot of questions from the judge. We were getting more questions from behind the bench, or as many as coming in front, because he was clarifying and checking and actually correcting and picking up some errors that Scott Egan, mind you, has been under scrutiny for the last 2-3 days, but he was getting years muddled up, dates muddled up, and a couple of times Justice Hall said, no, hang on, I think you got the year wrong, is that right? And he's picked him up on quite a few. I think probably I've heard more from Justice Hall today than quite a few other weeks that we've been, listening to this. He was really full on.
I mean, this is extraordinary when you think about the amount of information, the volume of information that he is receiving, and then to have this and be able to just
He's totally on the ball, absolutely picking up dates here and picking up, even to the point where because we've been hearing so much about when did this exhibit go out, when did it come back, did it go away at all, did we lose it? No, it was there all the time. And there's been a lot of that going on until one of the questions that Justice Hall said, well, did this exhibit get lost, or was it there the whole time? Was that a trick question? He said to the prosecutor, and she just said, oh, I'm trying to cover everything. I'm trying to cover all the ground, because it was a rather unusual question. When it wasn't lost, it was actually there the whole time.
I found it interesting, some of the statistics that you heard today. For instance, Tim, you heard about thousands and thousands of exhibits that were tested, and if you compare that to the amount of errors, it didn't sound so bad.
Yeah, well, right towards the end of Mr. Egan's evidence today, he'd been asked to go through in painstaking detail all the stuff that had been done, particularly with the fingernails, to track where they'd been, when they were out of the box and out of the freezer, and how they were being tested and where they were being tested, as we've done for weeks and weeks and weeks now. But right at the end of his evidence today, he was asked pointed questions by Miss Barbara Gallo, by which they were pointed and they got to the point. And one of those was, over the 25 years, how many interactions, actions, analyses of exhibits have PathWest done on Claremont exhibits, which now include the Clarke exhibits. He said 17,000 that he could find analyses. Now, that's not 17,000 different exhibits, but that's actions with exhibits, receiving them, extracting them, analysing them, running them again. So 17,000 things that they've done over the years, over the 25 years. And he said, applying the quality control measures, which also include typographical errors, labelling errors, and obviously contaminations. He said they found 28 in those 17,000 bits and pieces that they've done. And if you run the maths on that, which even I could probably do, he said that came up to about 0.16% of everything they've done has come up a little bit short. And then he brought up himself a study that had been done in the Netherlands Forensic Institute over there in Europe, that they'd done a similar study of a similar size sample base in 2004 of work that they'd done, and they came up with an error rate themselves of 0.3%, which, when you compare it to the PathWest figures that they've come up with, is about half. So you're right, we went really hard, and quite rightly so, at the end of last week with those 7 contamination events, including the one involving a completely separate case. We discussed with Damien on Friday whether this was going to be creating the reasonable doubt in the judge's mind, and the prosecution have got on the front foot today and tried to counteract that with these statistics, and it was pointed, as I said, and it was pretty hard nosed by Mr. Egan that he wanted to defend the work that him and his staff had done, and I'm sure it would have caught the attention of the judge. Not that he needs his attention caught, because his attention is always there.
Having said that, we don't know in those comparison figures how vital or crucial the errors were, because these were fairly telling when you've got 7 events where contamination took place right at the very heart of this very, very highly profiled murder case. The stories that we ran last week on these contaminated incidents, I think probably really go to the heart of the defence's case.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we're seeing now is we really are seeing Carmel Barbagallo starting to pick apart the defence argument.
Well, yes. I'm certainly anticipating it, and certainly trying to put in some defensive blocks to it before that defence has even been properly raised, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, all the way along, as she said a couple of weeks ago, she's guessing as to what they're getting at, but I mean, she's got a pretty good idea by now, and her questions to Mr. Egan went right to the bullseye, right to the heart of that today, to try and as I say, counteract it and get the prosecution on the front foot again.
What did Scott Egan have to say about the crucial nail samples and the possibility of those being contaminated with Bradley Edwards' DNA?
Yeah, well, that was the other major part of the end of Mr. Egan's evidence in chief this afternoon, whereby she tabulated where Mr. Edwards' DNA samples came out of the box, went back into the box, and where they were at all times, and cross-referenced that with AJM42. She didn't use AJM40 because it's been established that had never been opened, but from the time it came into the lab in 96 to the time it went to the UK in 2008. So she felt safe enough to leave that out. But AJM42, which is the other nail sample which was combined with 40, which then produced the crucial DNA result, that's the one that was opened, that had been tested, that was analysed at various times. And so she went as far as to produce not one, but 3 graphical representations of where both those exhibits were in comparison to each other and the timeline of them, and then asked Mr. Egan the question that we've been waiting for someone to be asked for months: is there any possible way you can see that one could contaminate the other? And Mr. Egan's quite blunt answer was, I can't see any viable opportunity or possibility that Mr. Edwards' samples and Ms. Glennon's fingernail samples could have come into contact with one another, because they were in a different box, on a different shelf. They were out of the box and out of the freezer at different times, months and sometimes years apart. And that is where they say the contamination could not have occurred. And Ms. Barbagallo, one of her questions today, went as far as to say it was fanciful, that theory could even be raised.
So how did he explain the female victim from another crime getting mixed up, and also the DNA from the fellow who handed in the knife?
Well, that's where Mr. Jovich will no doubt go tomorrow, Ali, I would suggest, in his cross-examination, because he will no doubt say, well, you can say all that. You can point to me the boxes and the times and the dates and the diaries, but there's no getting away from the fact that certainly on the sample from the unrelated victim, that wasn't supposed to fly out of a box or fly out of a tube either. So no doubt we will hear more about that today and be taken right into that argument again tomorrow.
Yeah, that'll be very interesting because, that's the one, the other thing that we are waiting for is to find out these very specific details about how there could be contamination. But really what he was saying today is there was no opportunity. From what he could tell from this timeline, there was no opportunity for this to happen.
Yeah, that's exactly.
He said there was about a year apart. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, so in specific dates, Mr. Edwards' DNA came in at one time, and Ciara's came in at another. There was about a 13-month difference between those. And then when they were tested again, there was Mr. Edwards' DNA came out in 99, I think, and then in the AGM 42 wasn't brought out again until 2004 when it went over to New Zealand. So that's 5 years between those, and that was what Mr. Egan, through Ms. Barbagalla's questions, was very keen to get on the record, is that as much as you can point to these other ones, in this particular instance, which we say is the important one, you can't show us anywhere, or does not appear to be anywhere, an opportunity for those two to come into contact with each other, those two exhibits.
And I was very interested today, Carmel Barbagallo questioned Scott Egan about Ciara's own DNA and its presence or lack of presence on her clothing and on her body.
Yeah.
What was that about?
Well, there was quite a few instances where there was no DNA from either the victim or anyone else, and none on her clothing. And of course, they're relying purely on those fingernail clippings as far as Bradley Robert Edwards goes.
And was he asked to explain that? Because I guess that's quite perplexing to people. If you've got, for instance, a blood-soaked top, it's quite perplexing that there would be no evidence of DNA. Was he asked to explain that, Tim?
Yeah, well, that was the one that stood out to me, Nat, as well. AGM 33 is the exhibit number. We know it as the T-shirt that Ciara was wearing on the night she disappeared, and then she was found still wearing when her body was discovered. And apparently, to the naked eye, and certainly on Karen Margolius, the pathologist's account, seemed to be soaked in blood. But when it was tested or when samples of it were later tested for DNA, no DNA at all was found on here, including Ciara's. Mr. Egan was asked to explain that, and the way he explained it was the biological matter might well have been on there, but it would have degraded to such a state through various weather, UV light, decomposition, just time exposed to the elements, that the DNA on there might have degraded to such a degree that not even Ciara's DNA was able to be reportably found when those samples were taken. And we've had many, many questions through the email to the podcast about why isn't it that Mr. Edwards' DNA can't be found on, or couldn't be found, or should it not be found on either of the victims, particularly when intimate swabs were taken, if sexual motive was indeed the motive. But this goes to show that it's not only an alleged attacker's DNA that might degrade, it's the actual person themselves who'd been wearing that T-shirt for that whole evening. I'd obviously, been out with friends, enjoyed an evening out, so there's no doubt that it's her T-shirt, but for whatever reason, the DNA couldn't come back strong enough to show it was hers.
There seemed to be an awful lot of examples too that weren't even tested. It just discovered that wasn't tested, that wasn't tested as we went through them all one by one, apart from her clothes. That's just a visual examination that they decided. We didn't hear much more about that.
And AJM40 was obviously one of those, Ali, which is actually now proving a boon to the prosecution because they can say, well, look, it never came out of the box, so how could it possibly have been contaminated?
Ali, did you feel today's testimony did anything to patch up PathWest's reputation?
I'm glad the last bit came out very late in the day when he did explain the very, very small percentage of errors compared to the size of the case. But again, just up until then, it didn't really fill me with confidence that things at PathWest were going all that well. And I know there have been shortcuts taken that we've found about since. But we're talking about a very serious tragedy, the highest profile hunt for a killer in this state. And although there's some of these errors, we're still talking about just not a normal or process, but again, hunting for this state's worst serial killer. That was what I found puzzling about some of the way they did things at PathWest.
Tim, how do you feel that the prosecution case went today? Do you feel that they sort of came back and dealt a blow today after what was a really, really terrible week for them last week?
Yeah, they were the questions they needed to ask of themselves to get on the front foot, I think, before the cross-examination of Mr. Egan begins tomorrow. And it felt like a little bit last week. Yes, it was no doubt it was embarrassing, but it was almost a purging, if you like, to get it out off your chest before someone confronts you with it all, because they knew it was coming. They've obviously known it was coming for some time, probably since Mr. Jovich's opening statement when he raised it as a possible issue. So, yeah, look, it was, as I say, it felt like a defence of their work, and probably one they needed to make, and probably one that they thought was fair in the context of all the criticism that's been coming their way through outside sources and in court as well. So, yeah, was it a positive day? Yeah, I suppose so, when you can get on the front foot. And right at the heart of the case, obviously, is the point Ali made right at the end there, and what the point Egan made was, what were the actual possibilities of these fingernails to become contaminated? And at the end of the day, that is the main thing that Justice Hall will be looking at when it comes to the end of it, because if that is they are the only opportunities, and he can't see any other possibility other than Mr. Edwards having left that DNA during an attack rather than it happening in the lab, then that goes a long way to the prosecution proving their case. So, yeah, tomorrow will be interesting because Mr. Jovich will get back up and get himself back off the ropes and come out swinging again, no doubt. And it'll be interesting to see what Mr. Egan comes up with in another defence, I suppose, if he has to make one of the processes at PathWest if they are put to him in negative terms.
Yeah, well, as you said, coming off the ropes, it does really feel like they're in the ring now, and it is a tough fight. Yeah,
absolutely. And just that little word that Miss Barbagallo threw in one of her questions, the fanciful notion that this contamination might have occurred at PathWest, that spoke volumes to me. She's certainly not going to take the criticism of PathWest lying down, because it is proving PathWest was up to the job, particularly in the way they stored the fingernail samples and then the way they transported them. That is really crucial to her case.
Well, thank you both for your time today, and thanks everyone for your feedback. We do read every email you send to us, and we do try to answer those questions in this podcast. You can contact us at claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au. We'll be back tomorrow for day 56. Chat then.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.